Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. This is episode 19, and I've got a very, very special webcast for all of you today. I'm joined by none other than Haz al-Din. He is the host of the Infrared Show, which you can find on the streaming platform Kick and on YouTube as well as X. He's also the chairman of the American Communist Party. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest. Haz al-Din, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. My first question for you is related to a post you made on X this week. It was about the Iranian response to Israel's attack that took place just a few days ago. And you made the case for Iran to move forward with a significant response against Israel. I'm curious why you think this is an important argument to make, given that Israel really didn't target any devastating or significant infrastructure. They didn't hit oil or nuclear facilities in Iran. So why do you think Iran needs to respond in a way that not just gives Israel a bloody nose, but shows them that they can no longer cross red lines?
Because already the top politicians in the Zionist entity are discussing a second strike because they think that Iran's lack of a response is something they're taking as weakness. It's very important to maintain strategic deterrence at all times. Moreover, the question also needs to be raised. This genocide in Gaza has been going on for over a year now. And as far as the people of Gaza are concerned, they've been shown no mercy whatsoever. And I'm beginning to doubt whether or not this can be a protracted conflict as far as the resistance strategy is concerned. The notion that Israel or the Zionist entity can be bled dry and that they could just exhaust it, I just think is a complete folly. This is a political conflict that demands a decisive political solution. And for now, it is a ladder of escalation and a game of maintaining deterrence. But at some point, there needs to be overwhelming and decisive action on part of the resistance forces to see through a political solution decisively. This conflict cannot continue to bleed out and just go on. The Zionist entity is committed already to the annihilation of all of the forces of the resistance, including Iran as a state. That's their perspective. They're not waiting. They're not waiting for this to play out and see what will happen. Politics is not a waiting game. It may be a waiting game when it comes to trade and economics, but when it comes to actual warfare, it is necessary to escalate to the point of a decisive outcome. And war is a game of chicken. He who takes the initiative, he who blinks first loses out. He who takes the initiative and shows courage and shows a willingness to risk wins. It's an ancient law of warfare.
But if Iran responds in a way that essentially is taking the offensive in what has otherwise been guerrilla warfare by the resistance against a conventional army, that being Israel, is this going to change the nature of the war throughout the entire region? Could this escalate things beyond belief? What do you think this sort of an approach is going to bring about for the region of the Middle East in this conflict?
Look, this conflict is an ugly and brutal conflict, and it has been since the creation of the Zionist entity in 48. The fact of the matter, however painful it is to accept, is this. The Zionist entity is comprised of less than 10 million people living inside of it who support the regime, is probably even less because among those millions include Palestinian Arabs, as well as Hasidic Jews who are against the regime. But in any case, we're talking about a region with over 400 million Arabs, and if you include Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan even in the picture, it's much, much more than that. So it's not rocket science. Is it true that Israel, together with the United States, has the capacity to cause severe damage to the Iranian state and to states in the region in general? Yes. but the people will survive and endure. And the same guerrilla tactics that they're employing in Gaza and in Lebanon can be applied on a region-wide scale. And in this such confrontation and in this such conflict, there would be a real exhausting of the capabilities of not only the Zionist entity, but the entire West. This is an extremely risky and decisive action, which I have no illusions as far as the costs are concerned. But again, this is a political conflict that needs a political solution, and everything has to be put on the table as far as risk is concerned. Such is the ugly nature of politics and warfare more generally. The Zionist entity has proven its willingness to risk a regional war. Now, whether it's actually willing to engage in such a war, the question is very simple. The martyrs of the Palestinian resistance, the martyrs of Hezbollah and of the Houthis in Yemen, as well as of Iranian forces, they've shown a willingness to sacrifice and lay down their lives for the just cause of liberating Al-Aqsa. Do the Zionists have the same courage? Are they willing to actually die for the Zionist project? I don't think they are. I don't think they are. I think they're cowards. I think that they're hiding behind technology, and that the minute their barrier is broken, they will flee back to where they came from. And they're already doing it, by the way, in huge numbers. But war is an ugly conflict. The Soviet Union sacrificed 30 million people to defeat Nazi Germany and to end that occupation. Even 1 inch of Soviet territory occupied by the enemy would have been enough of a pretext for them to wage an all-out war against the enemy, regardless of the humanitarian cost. This is the nature of war. This is what war has always been. There's no humanitarian solution, and there is no way that they could simply wait until the Zionists become exhausted. Because frankly, the supply of weapons and resources that is coming from the United States is practically unlimited. This can go on for decades at the current pace. And decisive and drastic action needs to be taken.
And one last question regarding Iran. Donald Trump is looking like he will be the next president of the United States. He left behind a very complicated legacy, a horrific, I think a stain on his actual administration, his legacy with Iran. You saw him take measures such as killing Qasem Soleimani. You saw the tearing up of the Iran deal. So if he's reelected, do you think he'll take this same sort of a neoconservative approach? Or do you think he'll take the approach of least resistance, which would be that of John Kerry and the Obama administration, who sought to bring an end to the Islamic Republic of Iran through diplomatic measures, such as the utilization of the Iran deal, actually?
Trump is a highly unpredictable personality. And if his rhetoric is anything to go by, that itself is contradictory. His willingness to change his positions and change his mind is highly unpredictable. And you have to have an appraisal that takes into account not just his rhetoric, but his backers. I mean, we know that this election, he's being backed majorly by the establishment, by the big donors, by the Zionist lobby, by the Adelsons and AIPAC. And rhetorically, he seems very committed to the Zionist entity. On the other hand, he's giving somewhat of mixed messaging with regard to talking about how he wants to end the conflict as soon as possible. There's mixed messaging as far as him making appearances on podcasts, talking about how last time he was elected, because of his lack of experience, he filled his cabinet with neoconservatives and warmongers, and that this time around he's not going to commit the same mistake. So what his real intentions are, I think, are not fully knowable. If I had to guess, just based on who's backing him, I would say that he probably will pursue a continuation of the current regime's policy in the region. On the other hand, Trump is an incredibly and highly unpredictable personality. There have been several assassination attempts already on his life. Who knows what's in store for us? We could see to what extent is Trump acting independently according to what he thinks is right and wrong. I don't think we should completely write off the possibility that an interesting foreign policy stance might be taken by him if he's in office as it regards the conflict.
Haz, I know you as the chairman of the American Communist Party. I'm curious, what drew you initially to communism, and why do you think so many Americans are still allergic to the word communism?
Now, when we talk about communism, oftentimes in the West, the first thing we're confronted with is the theory. What is communism? And strangely enough, in the West at least, we tend to regard the so-called theory of communism, which is usually translated in a utopian way, with the reality of communism as it's colloquially used and as it refers to actual communist states and historical events. What drew me to communism at the outset was not actually a theory. It wasn't a proposed utopia. It was the actual real history of communism that I was interested. I was interested in the fact that at one point, over 25% of the Earth's population was living under communist rule. I was interested in the fact that there once existed a great power with universal aspirations, the Soviet Union, which kept in check the murderous aspirations of U.S. imperialism. In an era growing up of the Iraq War, of the criminal U.S. hegemony acting with impunity around the world, increasingly emboldened by its unipolar status, it wasn't very difficult for me to eventually regard the Soviet Union as a kind of lost moral authority in the world. One that used to exist, which used to stand for some kind of principles of justice and the self-determination of nations, and so on, but which was gone. So in the Soviet past, a great deal of lofty aspirations for a future and just existence for mankind, I guess, could be projected. So communism to me meant an alternative to the current system. It meant an alternative to U.S. imperialism. It meant an alternative to liberalism. One that could be very powerful, one that worked, one that was lasting. And that's precisely why in the United States, communism has become so demonized, as a matter of fact, as the antithesis, so to speak, of the so-called American way and the American system in the post-war period. Because it's always represented this lost alternative. It's always represented this specter that's haunting us, that's whispering in our ears, so to speak, about all of the things we're neglecting, all the things we're ignoring as far as our responsibilities to our own country and to the world. It's become the ultimate boogeyman that represents an alternate universe. And this is something that I guess could be spun as very terrifying to Americans by a ruling class that was, for obvious reasons, terrified about the possibility that there could be an alternate form of development and an alternate system. This would contradict the entire base of power upon which it rests. So, to answer the question bluntly, and at the risk of indulging too much into theory, in a certain dialectical sense, communism became the ultimate antithesis of what America is, not by coincidence. The philosopher Hegel regarded America as the land of the future. He was writing this in the early mid-19th century. Hegel said that all of the burdens of history will reveal themselves in America. That's where the burdens will come to account, so to speak, with their true causes, with their true rational purpose. So even Hegel understood that as far as this end of history is concerned, America has a special significance as the land of the future. And communism, as far as Marx understood it, the greatest student of Hegel, in my opinion, and as confirmed by the facts of history, I would also argue, communism represented the future of mankind in its later stage of development. So the relationship between communism and America is much more, there is such a degree of antagonism between the two because of their close proximity. It's almost a kind of narcissism of small differences in a way. And as far as communism as the ultimate antithesis of America is concerned, it's not difficult to see why that is. On the one hand, America is the culmination of liberal modernity. It's the culmination of the nihilistic trajectory of modern capitalism, to the point where it has completely eliminated every trace of a traditional existence, every trace of a concrete human existence is completely liquefied and dissolved. It represents the ultimate dynamic, abstract, modern society created from scratch. And communism, on the other hand, represents the substantive return of mankind to some kind of concrete social existence. One that is particular, by the way. But the two end up meeting each other, so to speak, insofar as America's acceleration of the trajectory of the history of the West leads it to a new, fresh starting point. One whose implication and whose consequences are not known. You know, there is a, so to speak, an open door. There's a lot of ambiguity as far as what kind of new society and what kind of new future is represented in the aftermath of America's destruction of the traditional existence of mankind. And this is precisely where communism and its significance intervenes, in my opinion. It's the ultimate antithesis of America, yes, but on the other hand, this antithesis participates in the process by which America can finally discover its own unique and particular existence. And traditionally, the Hegel's dialectical system, in the vulgar sense, is represented by the three terms, you know, the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis. This is an extremely vulgar whatever, but it's vaguely correct, actually, in the vaguest terms. America represents the thesis, right? This kind of united republic based on negative freedoms and enumerated powers, and completely blind and indifferent to the substantive realities of concrete social existence, refusing to prescribe upon them any kind of judgments or privileged significance, just allowing people to associate how they see fit. And it's not really the business of government to decide. Then the antithesis, communism, which is the insistence upon a particular and determinate social existence, right? It's the complete antithesis to the liberal American freedom, supposedly, right? And then the third term is what should interest us, right? Is what conclusion is wrought from that, because the first term is an American is a universalism, right? It's a universalism that's completely indifferent to the particulars that culminate in it. The second is also a universalism. Communism proposes, a kind of united global subject, the international proletariat. And at the outset, this is formulated in a way that transcends and crosses all borders and cultures and nations and so on and so on. So here we have the encounter between two universals, Americanism and communism. Two universals, which, by the way, are the complete opposite of each other, right? But this such confrontation is what, in my view, can yield the possibility of the emergence of a real concrete particular, what Hegel would call the universal through the particular, or the concrete universality, the determinate universality. And in my view, that is what communism's significance for America is. It's this ultimate alienating kind of antithesis of everything America supposedly stands for, precisely because what America stands for does not yet have any particular content. It just stands for freedom and doing whatever you want, I suppose, as far as most Americans understand it. But that doesn't have any specific content. And communism represents a universalism at the same time that it's alien, because it represents the ultimate kind of totalitarianism, the ultimate kind of prescription of a specific, rigid, and fixed way of life, where, everything is controlled and everything is done in a specific way. But, in a sense, dialectically, the two, they almost appear the same if you think about it, right? This is just like how in Hegel's logic he identifies being and nothingness as the same, right? It's kind of the same relation between Americanism and communism. The ultimate form of freedom and liberty paradoxically culminates in the ultimate form of standardization, the ultimate form of rigidity and inflexible control and organization. It's not a coincidence that cybernetics itself originates. It's disputed its origins, but it was first implemented practically, systems of control in America, in the United States. Yeah, it's absolutely not a coincidence that communism is as demonized as it is in the United States. But I would just ask people appreciate the dialectical irony of why that is, and in a sense, how it proves the necessity and inevitability of communism's victory, not only in America, but why such a victory in America is necessary for the victory of communism on a worldwide scale.
Now, your American Communist Party recently held its first national convention in Chicago, Illinois. Could you briefly talk about, how many people were there, what type of people showed up, and where does your party go from here?
So the convention was broadly open to delegates from chapters across the country, and the purpose of the convention was to ratify our program and our Constitution. So we had delegates from all across the country, including from Canada, who came, and there were approximately a little over 200, I believe, who attended, a little less than 300, between 200 to 300 more or less. And what was discussed and proposed to them was, first of all, the purpose and mission of our party. Second of all, the details of our Constitution, our program, and we gave them the opportunity to ratify these. The people that we saw at the convention were, in my opinion, highly upstanding examples of what Americans should aspire to as far as moral quality is concerned, as far as the willingness to assume leadership, the willingness to sacrifice the individual self-interest for the interest of the community. They were highly educated. They were well put together. They were more or less what we would call model citizens, if not for the fact that they're communists.
The way I see America right now, there is an ideological void. I'm curious if there are any currents that you find interesting, any alternative ideological currents, besides the American Communist Party, that hold some sort of a significant sway amongst the American public that you are fascinated by or you're in some level interested by?
In the United States, I don't think so. I think that in the United States, we have had an incredible deficit of such thinking in general, which is unfortunate, obviously, and is incredibly disappointing for people like myself. But from what I can glean, all of the alternative political thinkers and visions in the United States are largely importing their ideas and their thinking from abroad, from Europe in particular, and in other cases from Russia. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Surrounding what they call the Peter Thiel network are personalities like Curtis Yarvin, who is famous for his neo-reactionary proposal of converting the government into a kind of monarchical enterprise, a business modeled off of a corporation, more or less. And I see hints of the utopian tradition in this kind of thinking, of, in the spirit of Silicon Valley, attempting to propose new models of and protocols of governance completely from scratch, and looking at our government in the same way that a Silicon Valley venture capitalist would look at a given economic or social problem and attempt to resolve it through technology. So there are some unique ideas that are coming from that milieu, that zeitgeist. Curtis Yarvin is probably the most significant one, but beyond him, in the context of the United States, there are not really many. There's not really anything going on in the sphere of political philosophy, in my opinion.
Do you think that if Trump is reelected, there could ever be the opportunity for individuals like Curtis Yarvin or even Nick Land to exert some level of influence on the administration itself?
Curtis Yarvin, yes. But Nick Land, no. These are thinkers that are lumped in together due to the irresponsible and, frankly, amateurish research of, mainstream journalists from the mid-2010s, late 2010s. And they attempted to kind of branch many very distinct schools of thought together by virtue of their heterodoxy and their lack of political correctness and their provocativeness. But Curtis Yarvin is what you would call, he is kind of a American pragmatist, utopian in some kind of sense. He's a Silicon Valley person. There's not a lot of philosophical depth as far as he's concerned, at least from by the standards of continental European thinking. But to what extent is he influencing Trump and the Trump phenomena? I think that it all goes back to the common denominator of Peter Thiel. I think that the so-called neo-Straussians, right? It's a very well-rooted ideology in that milieu as far as proposing alternatives for the Republican Party. I would say there are actually some similarities between Russia and the Republican Party of the United States, a horrible comparison in any other context. But I would say there's similarities in the sense that there is a vacuum, an ideological vacuum. To what extent that is being completely fulfilled by Yarvin's ideas, I have a lot of doubts. There are practical day-to-day needs, but it's clear the old paradigms within the Republican Party have broken down. The Trump phenomena has demanded a new kind of political philosophy. I think probably Yarvin and the Peter Thiel network and the Straussians, the neo-Straussians, they probably are filling that. Eric Prince is one of the people in this network. They're probably fulfilling it the most comprehensively compared to anyone else. But in my opinion, even they fail to really fully fill the vacuum. And the comparison to Russia is, of course, that Russia also lacks a clear ideological orientation today. It's hard to tell, but I think the moment that Trump begins to propose a dissolution of American democracy in favor of, that's when we will see the influence more clearly. Will he do that? I highly doubt it, frankly.
You know, it's interesting you brought up Russia in your last answer, because my next question for you was going to be about that. You know, Russia is arguably the leading fighter against Western imperialism and unilateralism. So what is Russia? Russia's not communist. What is the ideological basis in your eyes of Russia after the Soviet legacy?
So my heterodox understanding of communism, compared to, relatively speaking, I guess, is that, to me, communism is not, after the 20th century, primarily an ideology. It accomplished, and this is to kind of paraphrase Boris Groys, it accomplished the aspiration of the Platonic philosopher king by successfully uniting philosophy with reality itself. So there is an extent to which communism has actually became something materially real, regardless of how it's interpreted or reflected ideology. It's an irreversible effect that it has had upon the course of civilization and history, and there is no way to refer to this alternate paradigm of modernization other than communism. And that is not something Russia has been able to reverse, in my view. It may have reversed at the ideological level any kind of commitment to the communist idea, but communism as a concrete material reality is something that remains incomprehensible and oblique to the Russian mind, though it continues to exert its significance upon the reality. Now, this is especially the geopolitical reality, but not exclusively. To whatever extent Russia is able to pursue an alternate paradigm of development free from the financial slavery of the West, it has had to maintain some kind of degree of continuity with the infrastructure, with to another extent, the industry that was built under the Soviet Union.
You know, Haz, in Professor Alexander Dugin's recent book, Great Reset versus the Great Awakening, he talked about the fact that in the Western poles of civilization, there are a number of these populist, right-wing, anti-globalist forces that seek a return to tradition. Now, I'm curious, as a communist, as the chairman of the American Communist Party, do any of these, movements, do they interest you? Would you ever consider them an ally in the shared struggle, considering that they have a common enemy? It seems to me as though a lot of these forces, you look at Millet, you look at Meloni in Italy, you look at Afdi in Germany, or Le Pen in France, as soon as they achieve any level or realize any political power, they bend the knee to the establishment. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, as pragmatic as I am, they're not reliable allies. And that's precisely the problem. The reason they can't be reliable allies isn't simply because the ideological views that they subscribe to are incompatible with mine or with communism. It's a concrete matter of they don't have the theory to affect a long-term ability to organize, right, the masses. They don't have the ability to understand the difference between the individual, the subjective, and the collective, the objective. They're unable to make this distinction. So it's very easy for them to become confused, to become split, to become torn internally by subjective differences, by differences of personality, by all manner of pettiness, bribery, and intrigue. And it's very easy for them to be infiltrated and hijacked. Now, granted, the same is true for the Western left for the past decades. But in my opinion, the only way out is Marxism. That's not a dogmatic precept that I insist upon out of ideological devotion. It is something I believe to be concretely true, and which, as far as its ability to be proven to everyone, I think will be seen in the course of the development. How many of these factions will be around in the further course of the development of my own party, the American Communist Party? I don't think many of them will. I don't think it's a coincidence that something as minuscule as the communists in China, when they first declared their existence, there was only a few dozen, right? And through the course of the development of Chinese history through the 1920s, through the 1930s, somehow the communists proved to be the most reliable, the most organized, the most resilient. They were able to persevere where everyone else failed. Why? Because communism alone correctly clarifies the distinction and the proper place of the individual personality in relation to the collective whole, right? It clarifies the relationship between those two in ways that other outlooks I fail to. So it's a practical matter. As far as people willing to join in alliances for the pragmatic purposes of fighting a shared enemy, I have no objections to that. What I object to is trusting and relying upon forces that have proven themselves time and time again to be unreliable, to be prone to defeat and betrayal even at the moment's opportunity.
Now, besides the federal government, of course, and the intelligence community, who do you see as the greatest opposition to the future success of the American Communist Party?
I would say the greatest obstacle the American Communist Party is facing right now comes from two directions. One is the far right, which is promoting racial and sectarian division, and which is antithetical to the possibility of any viable resistance movement. And on the other hand, it's coming from the extreme liberal leftists who are, attempting to muddy the waters, so to speak, and declare us to be the fake communists and themselves to be the authentic representatives. They are misrepresenting what communism is. They're misrepresenting communism as an extreme form of progressivism and liberalism. And the right is obviously indulging in this mischaracterization. This is why Trump's camp is now characterizing Kamala Harris as a communist. So the two are feeding off of each other in a way that is proving itself to be a formidable obstacle to our efforts. But through patience and through resolve, we are confident it's not an obstacle that is insurmountable. It can and will be overcome.
My last question for you concerns where do we go from here? In Professor Dugin's book, The Fourth Political Theory, he writes about how communism is one of the quote-unquote dead ideologies of the past that failed to win history. More recently, over the past decade, he has said that he has discovered China and their developments, combining Confucianism with Maoism, with communism. What do you think this says about his initial writings in the Fourth Political Theory? He's recently said that communism, Chinese communism in particular, is the closest real-world example we could look to as to what a Fourth Political Theory would actually look like in practice. Does this mean that he was wrong when he was writing about communism? Or is the real Chinese communism different than the idea of maybe what he was referencing in the past, having grown up in the latter years of the Soviet Union?
Professor Dugin's Fourth Political Theory deals with the three previous political theories, liberalism, communism, and fascism, to the extent that they are modern ideologies, which were serve the purpose of guiding the political development of reality in different instances and terms. To that extent, communism as an idea, and this is why I think China is not as significant within this framework as far as Dugin's rejection of communism, because it was the Soviet Union that upheld the more kind of universalistic global infrastructure of communism. The Soviet Union represented a communist power, and that's the only kind of power it was. China is a Chinese power. Yes, it's ruled by a communist party, but it is qualitatively a Chinese power. The Soviet Union, yes, you could say in reality it was a Russian power. There's continuity with Russia from the past, but in many ways there's a discontinuity. In many ways, there are aspects of the Soviet civilization that were unprecedented by any previous civilization. So this was a civilization that was united and founded upon, it would seem at least, the communist idea. And that, the political superstructure at least, that collapses. But I think as far as the fourth political theory is concerned, I would say where it interests me is, in some sense, I agree with the view that there is a missing political synthesis. There's a missing political vision and ideology that can adequately fulfill the demands and necessities of the new era. The new era has catalyzed the necessity of a new political thinking that is radically unprecedented as far as the 20th century is concerned. But at the same time, I think communism is distinct from liberalism and fascism because there's also a communism of the real. There's not just the communism of the idea. There's a communism of the real. Remember, Marxism is about praxis. It's about the unity of theory and the material practice. So if the theory appears obsolete and gone, what can we say about the material practice? Well, the legacy of the material practice is evidently not gone, not only as far as the persistence of China is concerned, but look at the infrastructure upon which the entire global forces of resistance still more or less rely upon. It's a specific paradigm of resistance of Western colonialism and liberalism, which is the inheritance of the Soviet era. In the Middle East, Iran, which is not yet a nuclear superpower, it has done a lot to cultivate an alternative paradigm of resistance from the Soviet kind. But we see now, after a year following the October 7th attacks, we've seen that its ability to strike offensively rather than just defensively is severely, severely limited. It's frankly not enough. It's not enough as far as what's necessary for a serious confrontation with Western hegemony. Now, if we zoom out and we look at the kind of connections and alliances that are being built, people like to focus on BRICS, but the more interesting part of the story is the old Soviet-led world is, in a sense, coming back together. Russia is leveraging its former ties with socialists and even former socialist states in order to build a new kind of global socialist, or not a socialist bloc, but a new global bloc that is the inheritance of the old socialist bloc, excluding, of course, most of the Warsaw Pact. But we see with Vietnam, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with other countries in Latin America, with North Korea, right, the DPRK. We're seeing this old infrastructure, which was the inheritance of communism, coming back together. Now, look, as an American pragmatist, one can object to the dogmatic form of Marxism-Leninism that was institutionalized in the Soviet Union. But there is an extent to which it just worked. There's an extent to which it wasn't just a dogma, but a necessary interface with a real infrastructure that worked, that's necessary almost as like a technology, just to serve as the very basis for any subjective ideation in the first place, there is a material infrastructure that needs to be attended to. And in my opinion, there is a communism of the real, which is a real material infrastructure that is being neglected in countries like Russia, in my humble opinion. As an outsider and as a foreigner, my observation is that Russia is a country that has inherited a lot which it is not sufficiently, to a sufficient degree, attending to enough. This is in the geopolitical realm. There's geopolitical responsibilities that Russia has had to take responsibility for, which come from the Soviet era. I mean, why did the SMO happen? Think about it. Is it because Putin was so eager to go and have a war? No, he wasn't. If he was eager, he would have done it in 2014, which is what people in Donbass wanted him to. But the government of Russia at the time didn't. You know, they believed that there was a possibility for negotiations. Why? Because they didn't want to deal with the immediate economic consequences. But meanwhile, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and other forces, to be fair, were advocating for intervention much earlier. Now, but why is that, though? Because the very fact of there being Russian speakers in the Donbass, the very fact that they were under attack by the Banderites, the very fact of that they needed protection, that they needed some kind of future, they were being neglected by the Ukrainian state. They were being neglected. And why were they being neglected? Well, one of the reasons might be that even if Soviet Marxism-Leninism eventually became inadequate in terms of being responsive to the realities, what if that just meant it needed to be updated? Why throw the baby out with the bathwater? There were a lot of things that Soviet communism did well and did effectively, and all of these things just got thrown away, and everything was just supposedly started from scratch. From Marxism, at the very least, what works should have been preserved. And upon that foundation, sure, there can be new experimentation and new ideation and so on and so on. But there are objective responsibilities that are a consequence of the communist civilization, which, whether you like it or not, whether you are a communist or not, remain responsibilities that need to be accounted for. And there has been a lack of responsiveness as a consequence of the fact that Marxism-Leninism has been completely thrown away. It's one thing to understand the need for Marxism-Leninism to be updated. Mao understood this necessity in the context of China. But for all of it to be thrown away, the Russian state now, it's characterized by a kind of schizophrenia where half seems to still have its foot in this hopefulness of Western liberalism and the liberal paradigm. Frankly, the facts of history have shown the Western liberal paradigm is bankrupt. It offers no alternative. It offers nothing. Sure, there is an extent to which the Russian economy has been allowed to become more dynamic, right? But frankly speaking, this dynamism is a consequence of the information age and the rise of computers, the rise of cybernetics. Even the Soviet civilization and Russian civilization had its own paradigm of cybernetics that was lost and forgotten. There's no reason why this fascination and fixation and addiction to Western modernity should continue, in my opinion. It's just holding back the immediate necessity of responsiveness on the part of the Russian government to its inherited responsibilities. There cannot be one foot out and one foot in, you know, and so I sympathize with Dugin's view to a great extent. But that's why, paradoxically, I think the idea of the fourth political theory is also a unique opportunity to really put aside the ideological dogmas, right? Because there is an ideological dogma, a subjectivistic dogma. Put that aside, yes. That is gone. But now there can be an authentic confrontation with the real communism, the communism of the real, the one that's there objectively, regardless of our subjective responsiveness to it or lack thereof. There can be an objective legacy of communism while there is a subjective indifference, blindness, and negligence. Again, Donbass after 2014 is an example of this. The Russian state did not fully go in and assume its responsibilities, but the reality was still there, and it was demanding a response in some sense, but none was necessary subjectively. But we see the consequences of the lack of responsiveness. So this is my opinion on the question of the relation of communism to the fourth political theory. Fascism did not have an objective contribution to history beyond being a militaristic adventure. Now, liberalism, granted, has had an effect upon the course of the development of history, but this is an effect that was sublated by communism. Liberalism did not, in my opinion, did not introduce anything new in Russia. It opened Russia up to the predatory designs of the West, but all of the dynamism and how should I put it? The new kind of modernization Russia experienced after the 1990s wasn't the result of liberalism. It was the result of the information age, the result of the rise of computers and information technologies and the cybernetic era. And that is not something necessarily that has to be attached to liberalism. And China is the best proof of this fact.
Haz al-Din, chairman of the American Communist Party, where can people follow you along on social media? And thank you so much for joining me here today.
So we're primarily on X. You can follow my X account at InfraHaz, and you can follow the American Communist Party at ACP Maine.
All right, that's it, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Legitimate Targets. Be sure to drop a like, share this episode far and wide, follow us on all of our socials, and we will be back very soon with some more special guests and great conversations as we continue to see through the smoke and expose the truth in a world full of lies.